Okay. Hello, everyone. It is 12 o'clock on Thursday, January 30th. Welcome to this week's WSSDA InSession Live Legislative Update. Good to see you on screen and hope you all had a nice week. We're going to jump right in. We're going to just spend our time today highlighting some of what we heard at Public Education Advocacy Day, which we hosted in partnership with WASA and WASBO yesterday. Good to see some of you on this call with us in Olympia. We're going to talk through a couple of highlights from things that we experienced this week, look ahead and tell you what we know about week 4, remind you about our resources, and close on out. All right, and before we jump in, also just want to remind you all that the Q&A box is the best place for you to drop any questions that you might have for Cynthia and I. We'll be monitoring that throughout the course of our webinar today, so just please don't hesitate to use that if you want to jump in and ask a question at any time. You can see on the screen that we had a few dozen school board members, superintendents, student reps, and school district business managers joined us yesterday in Olympia at Public Education Advocacy Day. We are very appreciative of those that could take time out of their day and week to come down to Olympia to do some in-person advocacy with our legislators. That work matters, and it was just, from what we observed, a very impactful day in terms of helping to get common messaging around our WASA, WASDA, WASBO hot topics and priorities into the minds and hands of more legislators. So just wanted to shout out this day, say thank you for those of you that contributed in person. Say thank you also to WASA and WASBO for partnering and co-hosting that event with us. And I think what I would also just add is that if you didn't have a chance to come to Olympia in person, that is totally okay. And you still have the opportunity to send an email or make a phone call or send a text message, if that's your preference, to your legislators' offices, encouraging them to advance our priorities and hot topics. So please don't feel like yesterday was the only day to contribute. And also just we're appreciative of those who were able to take time out of their day and join us. Okay, so we are going to jump in and highlight some of this week's actions. Just a general comment. Cynthia and I were reflecting this morning and shared that week 3 definitely felt like the busiest week so far of session and the most intense in terms of public hearings and bills to be following, tracking, and engaging on. So safe to say there was a busy week for public education and others for sure. Over the course of week 3, we signed in or testified on 15 bills. You can check out our in-session written report that'll come out later this afternoon for a full list of that. But just sort of wanted to highlight some of the conversation. We'll be doing that throughout this hour on just a couple. The minimum maximum fund balance requirement bill was heard early on in this week. That's House Bill 2593. Rhonda Litzenberger, a school director from Eatonville, testified on WASDA's behalf in respectful opposition to that bill. We're going to dig into that here in a couple minutes. Additionally, Senate Bill 6247, which is the school district financial solvency bill from Senator Dozier. This is the bill that we spoke a little bit about last week that would essentially add some additional supportive rules for the ESDs over school districts as they get closer to binding conditions. And it also would have created a separate but similar required training for school board members around funding and finance. That school director training was the core of our testimony as other this week. And we essentially reminded the Senate that they had already advanced a bill out of their committee that contained a separate but similar school board training requirement. The other bill that had advanced, that Senate Bill 5860, we've talked about that over the last couple of weeks. That is the school board compensation and training bill. The training that was included in that bill was funded by the state, meaning that school directors would be required to pay $0 to access that, whereas the training that currently sits in Senate Bill 6247 would not be covered by the state in terms of cost. This bill also would have required an ongoing training requirement. So it would have required school board members to take that training once per term, as Senate Bill 5860 would have been a one-time requirement at the beginning of service. So our ask of the Senate was to align those training requirements and to move towards the training requirements that were in the other bill they already passed, due to the fact that it's a one-time requirement versus an ongoing requirement, and due to the fact that school board members would be able to access the training for free. We met with the bill sponsor ahead of the hearing, and he agreed to the amendments. They were not included during the public hearing this week, which is why we testified other, but we do anticipate that bill to be amended by the time that it's scheduled for executive session next week. The last thing I'll highlight from week three in terms of specific bills is House Bill 2257. This is the House version of the bill that would essentially be a technical fix to the Senate Bill 5814 tax that we inherited last session around temporary staffing and live presentations. We testified in writing as other, essentially thanking the legislature for taking the time to reconsider some of the unintended consequences that came from passing that bill, and to encourage, we're still continuing to encourage and urge a K through 12 exemption from sales tax on temporary staffing and live presentations. So more to come on that. A couple other things I would share, just some general comments about this week, is that the work to remove unfunded mandates from bills is gaining traction. Cynthia and I were able to successfully work with a couple of bill sponsors this week alongside our education advocacy colleagues to identify and draft amendments that would essentially make some of these unfunded mandate requirements turn into optional requirements with no funding, as long as there's no funding provided. So we're happy to see some work being done there and expect some of those amendment proposals to come forward in the next week or so. And then finally, we are getting ready for policy cutoff next week on Wednesday. That's happening on February 4th, which means this week, I think we started to feel a larger sense of urgency from our lawmakers and from our committees and from our advocates to either get bills moving or stop bills from moving. And what that policy cutoff means essentially is that any bills that the legislature can't tie directly to the budget would need to be passed out of their policy committee of origin by February 4th, which is next Wednesday. What that means for us, and we'll get into this in a little bit as we think about week four, is that about half of next week, we have a good sense of what's going to happen, and the second half of next week is still sort of to be determined based on lots of energy being provided towards that February 4th cutoff. It also means that the sheer number of bills that we're tracking and monitoring will reduce significantly, as every cutoff that happens throughout the legislative session essentially shortens the list of bills that continue to have movement throughout the process. So wanted to make sure you knew about that. Cynthia, anything you want to add generally to any of these comments about this week?
Yeah, something I'll just throw out there, I'll go back to the unfunded mandates, is legislators are really hearing us when we're like, we just need to put pause on unfunded mandates and are willing to make those amendments. And like Logan mentioned, we have been working with them. And so I just want to say, like, thank you to all of you who have been reaching out to your legislators, having those conversations, because we are seeing it at the Capitol.
Great. Thank you, Cynthia, and thank you, everyone. That we definitely have work in front of us as it relates to removing additional unfunded mandates, and we can only do that well with your help and with you helping us to connect with your legislators to share anticipated costs that come with those. So you're right. Thank you, Cynthia, and thank you, everyone. Okay, we're going to highlight just a couple of the bills that we talked about a little bit more deeply. In session, our written publication this week, you're going to see some highlights around the minimum maximum fund balance bill. In particular, a panel of testifiers that included a testifier representing the teachers' unions, Rhonda Litzenberger, who represented WSSDA, and then Jeff Snell, who's the executive director over at WASA, former Vancouver School District Superintendent. It was just this really beautiful panel that essentially represented many different perspectives in the K through 12 education system. And the conversation actually was just really great. There were lots of questions from legislators of this panel, essentially inquiring about process and additional perspective. And just really want to appreciate Rhonda Litzenberger. I'm not sure if she's on here today, but her testimony was very helpful. And we heard afterwards from advocates in the room as well as legislators that, man, they really, really appreciated that panel that was up there. Um, I highlighted in quotes here one part of the testimony that Rhonda provided, which essentially speaks to the position that we were engaging in on the bill. As a reminder, we did testify con on that bill, essentially reminding the legislature that while we absolutely support transparency and fiscal responsibility across the K through 12 system and understand the goal that this bill could be trying to work on to support school districts to have sustainable, financial, healthy systems. And yet, we still believe that local school districts are in the best position to determine how fund balances work, whether or not there are specific minimums or maximum requirements, given the unique needs and circumstances that you all, as school board members, are best set up to understand. As a result of that hearing, that was House Bill 2593. By the way, I don't think I said that. That was on Tuesday morning. As a result of those conversations, we are anticipating some amendments to the bill that would essentially remove the maximum fund balance requirement that's currently listed, and then also make the minimum fund balance requirements to be non-penalizing for districts. So that bill is scheduled to move ahead of next week's deadline. I forget if it's on Monday or Tuesday when that bill is scheduled for executive session, but we are anticipating some amendments to that bill. We have not seen those yet. Also, want to, oopsie. Also, want to highlight again around House Bill 2160. We highlighted this one, I think, last week in our in-session written publication as well. This is the bill that would determine or update sub-eligibility for staff during their second year of employment. This is a bill sponsored by Representative Birnbaum and a number of others. The unfunded mandate that's included in this bill remains the largest that we've seen presented during this legislative session. And again, while we absolutely would want all of our school staff to have access to all of the benefits, our concern here is essentially around the unfunded mandate in the bill. And our ask of you all is to please continue to share your budget assumptions under this bill with your legislators. And also, I think in terms of updates, what we want to say this week is that our colleagues from WASA and WASBO met with Representative Berquist this week, who I think is planning on proposing an amendment to refocus the employer language so that we're essentially focused on single employers, not multiple employers. For context there, right now, the bill would essentially allow the hour threshold to carry over. If I was subbing in the North Thurston School District, I hit the threshold, and next school year I want to move over to the Tumwater School District or the Olympia School District, that'd be able to follow me. And what the amendment is going to focus on is essentially saying a single employer. This bill is not currently scheduled to move. We do anticipate that it will be. And because this is a budget bill in the budget committee, its deadline is not February 4th. However, it is February 9th. unless it's deemed necessary to implement the budget. So we do anticipate this bill continuing to move, and we are working hard to work on the unfunded mandate pieces. And we're seeing and hearing about amendments such as the one we just talked about that will help to make the bill hopefully better and better. Okay. So we are going to switch topics and start thinking about week 4. We, like I said, know some of what we're going to be doing next week, and we still don't know yet about others, so we'll get into that. But in summary, what we want to share with you as a result of that policy cutoff on February 4th, there are many bills that are scheduled for executive session in policy committees. What this means is that these bills have had public hearings, either during weeks 1, 2, or 3 of the legislative session, and it's now the committee's time to essentially decide whether or not they're going to advance these bills to the next step in the process. That means that there will not be many public hearings next week, at least in the policy committees. Much of their time will be dedicated to making decisions about moving bills forward. We will be reviewing that list and essentially trying to figure out which of those bills still contain unfunded mandates. We know there's been some amendments that we've been working on and that will be coming in the next couple of days. And again, working to get as many of those out as possible before they move out of their policy committees. That's sort of Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday in summary. And then as we move towards the end of the week, the fiscal and budget committees in both the House and Senate will hold longer public hearings on Thursday, Friday, and Saturday during week 4. Typically, the fiscal committees hold their time from 4 to 6 p.m. On a couple days of the week. During this week, again, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, those meetings will be starting as early as 10:30 in the morning, and likely still finishing by 6. They might have to go longer depending on what they've got in front of them. Because there will be a rush of bills coming out of policy committee this week, that essentially means that our fiscal and budget committees only have a couple of days to determine which bills they're going to hold public hearings on and which bills they're going to move into their executive sessions and decide what to move forward, because the fiscal committee cutoff is Monday, February 9th. So much of the work in budget committees will be done towards the end of next week, over the weekend, as well as on Monday, February 9th. And many of the bills that will advance will sort of move over the course of next week and weekend. We will be engaging there. Right now, those Thursday, Friday, and Saturday budget hearings do not have schedules attached to them, meaning we aren't sure yet which bills will be scheduled for public hearing or executive session during those days. So there is much that is unknown at this time. We will continue to keep you apprised as we learn more about what will be happening next week. There is one bill. So like I said, the policy committees are not doing much in terms of hearings next week, but there is one bill that we wanted to pull out and highlight for you, and that is Senate Bill 5849. Our position next week during the public hearing will be in opposition. This bill would make financial education a graduation requirement in school districts. In summary, what this bill requires is a couple of things. First, it would require all districts that operate high schools to provide financial education instruction beginning in the 29-30 school year. Beyond that, it would also add the graduation requirement for financial education for students beginning with the class of 2033. And our read on this bill is that it does not ensure any funding for school districts to implement this new requirement. You all have adopted a number of positions that touch on graduation requirements, that touch on unfunded mandates, as well as full and ample funding for those graduation requirements, leading us to be planning to weigh in next week in an oppositional position on Senate Bill 5849. I will also note this bill is scheduled during Wednesday's Senate Education public hearing, and Wednesday is the policy cutoff. February 4th, for bills to essentially have to move out of their policy committee in order to remain in motion. So it is very possible that this bill will not move forward this session. However, we don't have a sense right now as to how or if this topic could come up as it relates to budget conversations. So we think it's important to go on record to share some oppositional testimony at this point. So wanted to make sure you were aware of that bill. And then, as I mentioned previously, we still do not know what things will be looking like in the Appropriations and Ways and Means committees next week. Those are the budget committees. Our primary goal in navigating those couple of days will be to continue to work to remove unfunded mandates for school districts from bills that move through. And you can check out our in-session legislative update later today for a full list of what we are tracking and anticipating at this time in this area. The last thing we wanted to provide you before we close out is just a reminder of all of the wonderful resources that Cynthia walked through last week that we continue to provide an update to support you, including our Bill Watch, contact information for legislators, committee testimony, etc., the cutoff calendar, our legislative planning action tool, and others. I do see a question that just popped in. How many financial literacy budget trainings are legislators required to take when beginning service in the legislature? Great question, and the answer is 0. We have continued to raise and make this point with legislators as they have continued to move these bills forward. Okay. A couple of other reminders for you before we close out is that our advocacy skill building training around testimony prep will be happening as a part of our Advocacy Action Network on February 10th at noon. If you are not already getting emails about our February 10th meeting and you'd like to, just let us know by sending us an email at strategicadvocacy@wasda.org. Happy to include you. Okay. Cynthia, before we work to wrap up, would love if there's just anything else that you want to add at this time. Or any other questions. I should look to see if we have any other questions in Q&A. I do see one, but anything you want to add before we go to that, Cynthia?
No, nothing to add. I definitely recommend coming to the Advocacy Action Network for testimony prep. We did move it up to a week before. And so I know that is something that we've been getting a lots of questions on, and we're more than happy to help on knowing how to prep. I know it could be very intimidating, and so we want to give you the best tools for when you do go up on the stand or you testify virtually.
Great. Thank you, Cynthia. We do have one more question. Just wondering if there's any updates on Senate Bill 5918. That is the MSOC, Material Supplies and Operating Costs Bill. The update on that is that it has been scheduled for executive session out of the Senate Early Learning and K through 12 Education Committee for next week. Excuse me. However, we are hearing that it will be a challenge for that bill to get a hearing once it lands in the Senate Ways and Means Committee, which is where it would be going next. Again, based on budget and revenue challenges of the legislature. So we'll be putting out some details in our in-session written update there later to encourage you all to ask for a hearing on that bill in the Ways and Means Committee after we anticipate it moving out of the Senate Ed Committee next week. I believe that's on Wednesday's list for Senate Education. So we'll be watching that closely. And in our conversations with the bill sponsor and committee chair, Senator Lisa Wellman, this week, we do anticipate at minimum for that bill to pass out of the Education Committee as it's scheduled for next week. Okay. We are going to move to close. We've got a shorter update for you this week, and what I want to close with, I know you saw this picture earlier, but I just want to put this picture back on the screen because as I was sort of looking at it and reflecting on our day yesterday, it just really makes me proud to know that all of you are engaged in this work, whether you're in person like many, many were yesterday, or you're advocating to your legislators virtually, via testimony, via email, via text message, phone call, etc., gathering data, sending it to us, sending it to your legislators. This really is a collective effort, and just feeling really proud that so many of you are here and contributing in other ways. So, just want to say thank you to all of you for helping us to best represent our conversations and your needs with legislators this session. Week three has been tough, and I'm going to continue to push us to engage and stay connected as we move into week four and beyond. So, with that, we hope you all have a lovely weekend. Take care of yourselves, and we will see you all here next week at noon.